Hi and welcome. The first thing we're going to cover in talking about research methods is ethics. This is the most exciting part. I'm sure you're all really jazzed for it, so let's get into it. So I'm going to start with an example of a study. Now I'll include the link to the full video and you can view this. But in essence, it is about classical conditioning. So if you're familiar with Pavlov's dogs, this is where Pavlov would train dogs with a bell. And every time they heard a bell, they would be fed. And if you've ever had a dog and you put food in front of them, they start salivating. And so he trained them to basically start salivating every time they heard a bell. And the question was, can we do this with people? Well, if you think about an adult, they probably are going to know what's happening and they're going to respond. So there was a scholar back in the 1920s who decided, you know what, a baby sounds like the right answer. Let's give that a go. So Baby Albert is the name of the study. And they took Baby Albert and they showed him some things that he wasn't scared of and was kind of interested in. In this first picture you see, they showed him some fire, and he seemed very interested in that, as all babies are. And then they showed him a monkey, and then he was kind of interested in the monkey. Then they showed him a dog, and he pet the dog. Ooh, soft, isn't that so nice? And then they showed him a little white rat, and he was interested in the white rat and felt his soft fur, and that was all fine and good. And then what they did is that every time little Albert would reach for the white rat the next time, they would bang a loud bell, similar to what they did with Pavlov and the dogs. And so you can see here, every time he reached for the bell, or reached for the rat, the bell went off and little Albert started crying. So after they conditioned him to be scared of things with fur like the rat, when they brought in the other options like the dog, he would become scared. And anything that had fur, he would start crying and run away from it. And then they brought in things like this. This is supposed to be a Santa Claus mask. And I know times have changed, but this is the scariest mask I've ever seen. And to think of this as a Christmas mask is a little concerning. But it turns out he was also scared of Santa Claus because Santa Claus had a white furry beard. And I don't know about you, but I'd be terrified of that mask too. But in essence, what they found out is that they could indeed condition a human being to be scared of things with certain textures. And so the Baby Albert study got a lot of attention on how you can condition people. But someone thought, hey, you know what maybe we shouldn't do is put babies in front of fire and make them scared of animals, like dogs and things. And so there were some questions that arose out of that. And so those kinds of questions are essentially what we're going to talk about this week. And so kind of starting with, why do we make you take research methods? Well, one of the things is we want you to be able to critique information. You're exposed to a lot of information, not all of it good, and you have to be discerning in what is good information and bad information so that you're not taken advantage of by those that are out there. Also, we would like you to improve writing skills and critical thinking skills. So part of that is going to be some of the assignments we'll do through the semester. You're going to use some of the research methods we're going to talk about. There's also an aspect of writing that's going to occur. This is a Writing in the Discipline course, the WID course, so there is a writing expectation. You will get some feedback, but I'll try not to make it too painful. Now, this is a minor point of communication versus communications. And most people would ask, does it even matter? Which one are you doing? Are you studying communication or communications? Well, communication is the process of sharing meaning. This is the human-to-human part of it. How do we understand things that happen? Communications is the technological system we use to deliver the information. So one could study how communication occurs over communications, but the content of that message is really what we are talking about. We may choose different kinds of messages and communicate differently given different types of communications options, but we are in general in this class talking about communication. So a couple of important terms that we're going to get into through this semester and are relevant as we get into talking about ethics. And these are theory, research, and method. I'm going to use these a lot, as well as methodology. So theory is any explanation between variables. This could be a well-established theory, this could be a new theory, but this is just the reasons why things happen. This thing happens and this other thing happens, that's the theory. It's really the process or the explanation of how the world works. When we talk about research, that's the in-depth study we go through in order to find new information to help explain a theory, test a theory, develop a theory, just gain information, and then we develop theories to explain the things that we have observed. The method is the actual tool that you are going to use. So it is the technique or the procedure. Do you do a survey? That is a method. That is a tool. Do you interview someone? That is a different method. There's also methodology, or the study of method. And so we can talk about how to do a survey well. We can talk about how to do an interview well, compare an interview to a survey. That is a methodology question, whereas a method is simply the instructions. So ethics, this is the fun part. What is this thing? Well, there's lots of ways to think about it. We can talk about different versions. There are religious beliefs about this. There are many philosophers who have questions about it. This is about living well and doing good. This is about maintaining what's known as the social contract. You can go to a dictionary and you can find this is about how we govern our choices. Oftentimes when people think about ethics, they think about their religious background. This is what my religion tells me is a proper way to live and an improper way to live. But in general, the textbook talks about this is your actions, your thoughts, your values for how you choose how to interact with people. So it's sort of your rule book for how you find it is appropriate to behave. Now, there are a couple of ways that this is important to think about when we talk about how this affects research. One of them is something called the spiral of silence, or the silencing of science. So if you disagree with the results that someone might find, is it appropriate for you to tell them not to announce it to the world just because it disagrees with your worldview? So this is something that is an ethical concern that scientists and social scientists often have to grapple with. You might find something that is uncomfortable or unsettling to people, and you just might have to deal with it. Another thing that is a question of moral versus amoral science. So for instance, during World War II, the Nazis engaged in lots of medical testing on people. Now, this was without patients' consent. They simply took prisoners and they started harming them and then seeing if they could fix them. And if it didn't work, well, bring in the next one and we'll try something else. So that's, on the amoral side. Whereas moral is, do we take care of people? Do we treat them appropriately and fairly? Are they compensated for their time? And so another way we can think about it is utilitarian ethics. And often a question is, not all risk can be avoided, but if there is some sort of harm that may happen by your research, do the benefits outweigh the harms? So in other words, do we get more than the harm that is produced by doing the research? So if you think back to the Baby Albert study, did we get more information and knowledge compared to how much trauma we inflicted upon a baby? I don't know, right? And so that's for the utilitarian question. We weigh the pros and cons. How much did we get out of it and how much is worthwhile? But one of the things that we look to make sure that there is consistency across academic institutions, to make sure that we are protecting people, that we are not replicating a Baby Albert or some of the other videos that I have made available for you. So like the Zimbardo study, the Milgram study, and so on. We have an institutional review board, and their job is to make sure that research is conducted appropriately and fairly, and we are treating people with respect and care. So who gets on the IRB at WIU? We'll look at it in just a second, but their job is to maintain the guidelines. And so there's something called the Belmont Report, which outlines some things that you have to do as someone who is supported by the federal government and does research. So the fact that a single penny comes from federal dollars to this institution means we are now obligated to follow the Belmont Report. So in other words, your financial aid packages mean that we have to follow the Belmont Report. And the Belmont Report simply says that we have to maintain respect for others. Beneficence means that we are doing good and that there is justice being served, so that we are treating people fairly and appropriately. So we can't just go grab people and start jabbing them and see what happens. So here's a list of the current IRB members according to the website. You can see they come from a variety of disciplines. So if you think about the kinds of questions that we're talking about, of subjecting someone maybe to an incredibly violent video and seeing how they respond. So these are the people who will determine if your study can proceed. And so you have someone from education, kinesiology, nursing, sociology, psychology, law enforcement and justice administration, biochemistry, and English, as well as a community member. So these are the people who will decide what kind of risk you are putting people through and whether it is appropriate. Speaking of, there are different types of risks that they assess. So the first is we determine if you have a project that is what is considered exempt. In other words, there's minimal risk. This is a simple standard survey, for instance. There's no harm that's going to be done. You're not doing anything unusual. And you are just going to ask people to fill out some basic questions. Minimal risk, not a big deal. Carry on. Expedited review is something that takes a closer look by the IRB administrator, but not the full board. So it doesn't require all of those people to get in a room to determine if this is something that requires their full attention. So maybe you ask some questions that could be emotionally charged. You might be asking someone about, say, think about something traumatic from your childhood. That raises flags. Childhood trauma takes a little bit more information, a little more consideration for how we go about doing this. And then you have non-exempt projects, which there's more than minimal risk or includes risk to participants. So let's say, for instance, a study I was involved with, I asked people to tell me about their intent to use a drug illegally. In essence, I asked people to tell me that they were going to commit a crime. Well, I had to make sure that I was doing some things to protect them, to make sure that I wasn't asking people to admit to their intent to commit a crime, and so therefore I don't feel obligated to have to turn them over to the police. Now, one of the things that we are expected to include is this informed consent sheet. So if you ever participated in an online research study at WIU, you're going to see all of these things. It's going to tell you who's doing the project, what is it called, how do you get a hold of them, what's the point of the study, what are you being asked to do, what is the benefit, how are you being protected, is this voluntary, are you being forced into it? So all of these things have to be provided up front to someone who enters into a research study to make sure they're being protected. And lastly, privacy is something that is a big deal for research. I want to make sure that your responses are confidential and that, to the best of my ability, they will remain anonymous. I want to make sure that I cannot connect an answer to an individual. So if you are sharing some childhood trauma, I want to make sure that is confidential. I'm not sharing it with other people. And that I am not walking around and I'm looking, I see you. I know what happened when you were a kid. I know what happened to you, right? We don't want that to happen. If we're going to be honest in how we respond to these studies, we want to make sure they're being protected. So that's your first glance at research ethics. Some of these things will come up as we talk about particular methods, but in general, those are the things that we are concerned with.